Have you ever wondered why there aren't games like RuneScape? A little while ago, after a nasty mix of leagues in PVM, I burnt myself out on Osrs. I decided to decompress, to do some AFK grinding and explore some of my back catalog that has, over the past few years, grown immensely. Indie games, AAA blockbusters, and everything in between have become mainstays in my list of uninstalled titles I haphazardly bought and quickly forgot about. Viewers of this channel are likely aware that I discovered or rediscovered Oldschool Runescape a year or so ago, which helped me actualize the elements of an MMO and an RPG that I value the most. Considering those two overlapping genres inhabit my favorite archetypes in the medium, they naturally frame my interests even in other games. It didn't take long until I found myself having a rather strange feeling, that of déjà vu and nostalgia, playing through a small indie title named Flyknight. Let's see if you can guess what stuck out. Flyknight is equal parts RuneScape and Kingsfield. On its surface, an odd combination, yet one that at least aesthetically makes perfect sense. These are two drastically different fantasy games, yet both have left their mark on the industry, even if lingering slightly out of the mainstream, treated as a footnote to grander titles, World of Warcraft, Elder Scrolls. In some ways, Kingsfield is your favorite game developer's favorite fantasy game, and RuneScape, well, that's what interested me. Over my 3-hour playthrough of Flyknight, I couldn't help but think, why? Why is the second or third most popular MMORPG on Earth so disconnected from its influence? Why have we gotten dozens of multi-million-dollar WoW clones and not a single large studio tackling even the vague appeal of RuneScape? After all, so many 90s kids likely have played RuneScape at one point, and even more recognize its art style, its music. The main theme can be the soundtrack to someone's 6th grade as much as it can be the orchestral rendition of fantasy shortly after Y2K. It's ubiquitous. But is that all influence is? An aesthetic pastiche of a simile, a callback, a reference to make someone point and go, wow, it's just like that one game. Skin deep, impossible to drown in. RuneScape's influence feels like it has mostly been cultural. To understand this, we ought first break down the operative functions of influence. What is it and how does it work, at least in the scope of art?
From wizard to warrior, or bard to bard.
Inspiration, which is to say the byproduct of being influenced, can be delineated into two categories: aesthetic and mechanical. Aesthetic inspiration is what it sounds like, an appreciation for an art style, a soundtrack, or more vaguely, a vibe. Take a look at the PS1 era graphical trends present in some of today's indie titles like Ultrakill, Mouthwashing, Lunacid, and my favorite, Iron Lung. All short-form, independent projects that use an evolution of the retro aesthetic in a captivating way. Retro is an interesting term in and of itself, as it evolved from connoting 8 or 16-bit games to this, the era preceding the tail end of 2D, low-poly, texture-mapped, and lacking depth buffering, leading to the distinct wobbliness of models. Now, many of these creators may be too young to have themselves played a PS1 era title in its heyday, but the influence of this new retro functions much like it once did. You may not be inspired directly by what you play, you may just as well have been influenced by a hazy recollection of watching your older brother play. I'm old enough to have grown up around the PS1 and PS2 era, yet my most vivid memories outside of these two consoles is with the Dreamcast, particularly of a completely forgotten game, Draconis: Cult of the Wyrm, a fantasy RPG created by Treyarch, a small studio that went on to create some of the best-selling games of all time with the Call of Duty Black Ops series. Draconis is visually identical to this new retro. Looking back, it looks eerie, forgotten, lost. With the murky haze of low draw distance matched with the flat plains and bizarre landscapes, these feelings aren't surprising because they tend so acutely to our modern sensibilities, this internet age's obsession with new media trends like analog horror, which evokes the very same imagery in a different context. The abstract, fuzzy picture is as at home in the backrooms as it is in Iron Lung, because the influence stems from the exact same place. It's a reinterpretation of aesthetic shorthands that lends new meaning to a bygone era. The graphical limitations of the time were an ever-present problem to solve for developers piecing together worlds that were conceptually far too large for the 8 megabits of VRAM the Dreamcast had. That's why you see the quintessential low-hanging fog ensconcing the playspace, rendering faraway objects gauzy, almost intangible. What at one point was standard and expected evolved in a collective memory, taking on new meaning thanks to transformative media such as internet horror stories and low-resolution recordings.
Did some charity work and got a blessing, did you? Don't think I'm gonna just fall over dead because you know how to carry some water around.
But at least it's a fair fight now. Let's go.
It fits then that the graphical limitations of the past became unintended points of inspiration. After all, innovation often comes from overcoming limitation. These aesthetics lend themselves perfectly to indie horror, but they also exist past that narrow genre. What a low-poly style offers is the ability to create assets quicker to lighten the load on tiny development studios working with a single artist. Innovation comes from the peculiar discovery that you can achieve something more consistently and quicker all at the same time. It is very rare that something is innovated in a more complex pipeline, even when the function in itself is more complicated. We've now seen the joys of simplicity hold the world in the iron grip of engagement. The most popular new titles in recent years have almost all offered aesthetic simplicity and quick turnaround. Fortnite, Among Us, Lethal Company, Minecraft, and each one has since had its fair share of influence and, much like influence tends to be, it's aesthetic in nature, even though I hope to have since proven that even aesthetic influence is not as simple as one may expect. The purpose behind the decisions to create within a specific art style is conscious, and even if the intent 7 games removed may be to capitalize on trends, the potential from that choice remains. The benefits of the style are still present. The second type of inspiration is mechanical. This form often pairs with the aesthetics, such as in a Souls-like, borrowing much from the Dark Souls series' visuals, narrative, and of course, mechanics and systems. These can often seem like homologous pairings, inextricably bonded by the fabric of consumer expectation, but not always. Another Crab's Treasure, for example, looks closer to Fortnite than Dark Souls, and yet it is unmistakably a Souls-like. On the other hand, Lies of P is a not-so-distant cousin of Bloodborne, another game made by From Software inhabiting the same architecture of Dark Souls. Where mechanical inspiration becomes more nuanced is in what the developer takes and why. Let's look at Lies of P. You play as Pinocchio in a dark narrative loosely based on the adventures of Pinocchio, a children's book written by Carlo Collodi in the late 19th century. This is what makes Lies of P a captivating game to analyze, since it wears the aesthetics of both Bloodborne, a Souls-like, and Pinocchio in a very similar fashion. Its points of visual and even mechanical inspiration are cherry-picked and lightly remixed. The influence of a children's book generally starts and ends at basic thematic and visual reversals, painting a cautionary children's tale with a darker and more imprecise brush. Quite frankly, it's all very surface level, and if one were to read the original children's novel, they may find substantially more depth in its narrative, both thematically and not, than in Lies of P, which often reads more like a standard anime than a 19th century Italian novel. You'd think otherwise, considering the overwhelming amount of self-righteous clarification on the subject present in IGN's review comments section, with commenters eager to point out that the original was also quote-unquote dark. But dark in this case is an oversimplification of what exactly the original's narrative focus was. Collodi himself wanted to create a cautionary tale, the ending of which saw the titular protagonist get hanged by his enemies, the fox and the cat. Quote, "And the swinging gave him atrocious spasms, his breath failed him, and he could say no more. He shut his eyes, opened his mouth, stretched his legs, gave a long shudder, and hung stiff and insensible." Unquote. This comes at the heels of his misdeeds. It's cautionary precisely because of Pinocchio's flawed personality. As described by the book, he's an imp, mischievous and rude. He gets up to no good and gets punished as a result. Pinocchio's identity is at the center of this story and, crucially, its most evocative feature. In translation, Lies of P doesn't retain, well, any of these features. The resemblance to Pinocchio is barely perceptible other than the most emblematic features, such as his nose growing after a strangely integrated, narratively linear lying system. Bear with me here as I become a little bit more negative from this point on. The influence that these two megalithic titles have had on Lies of P is a depiction of the way pastiche and homage often replaced novelty and inspiration. I think a more inspired writer may have integrated the characterization in the original novel into the game. Pinocchio as he exists in Krat is a humorless player insert, a standard RPG tabula rasa that a player is expected to impose onto, yet because the game is more concerned with action than narrative, they never get the chance to. You're left with a shallow husk that evokes the Wikipedia summary of a novel. It uses the names, the premise, and chooses very deliberately to avoid anything that pierces its shallow skin. But that, in and of itself, is perfectly fine. Not every aspect of inspiration should just be a retelling. You can liberally borrow from a source and create something entirely new, and in this case, Lies of P has done just that. It has taken a whimsical children's story and turned it into a half-dreary, semi-esoteric, pulpy anime where half the enemies you fight are jaw-droppingly creative puppets and the other half are generic monster of the week zombies. Whether that sings of creativity or not isn't the point, it's what was chosen and what was left behind. In this case, the surprising humanity found in the original novel is forgotten in favor of he lies and his nose grows. This very same influence-driven paradigm can be found in what it chooses to take and forget about Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and the other From Software titles that have since paved the way to form an entirely new genre, the Souls-like. A genre that is itself just a combination of two other genres, but that's a video for another time. A Souls-like is a somewhat difficult thing to define. Strangely, a lot of genres are. What is and isn't an RPG? What is and isn't a roguelike? Which elements of these genres are crucial in defining them, and which elements can be left by the wayside without losing their DNA? To me, a Souls-like is defined by two systemic pillars, exploration and deliberate paced combat. These two systems are paramount in creating a successful Souls-like because they are symbiotic. They can only function well when paired together. The exploration of a Souls-like, the secret areas, the mysteries, the cryptic, sometimes obtuse world design, is the most recognizable element of a Souls game. It's an effortless depiction of what an exceptional three-dimensional Metroidvania would play like, yet the level design in Dark Souls 1 is often the element that is not replicated in its influence. How come Souls-likes are boiled down to deliberate, punishing, often overly difficult combat and dodge rolls? Why has the second pillar overtaken the first to become the language of the genre? Simply put, and I apologize for my bluntness, because most creatives do not have the talent to conceptualize a world as meticulously designed as Lordran in Dark Souls 1. In fact, even some of the greatest directors in the medium, such as Miyazaki himself who created Dark Souls 1, did not replicate its depth until over a decade later with Elden Ring. He iterated on the combat, made more consistently impressive beats, but the core experience of the first half of Dark Souls 1 remained untouched. It is much easier to create the Dark Souls combat system than it is to create the Dark Souls world design. That isn't to say creating a decent combat system is easy, it by no means is, but a combat system at the level of depth most present in a Souls-like can be accomplished through meticulous testing and iteration. To be pretentious and esoteric for a moment, great world design can often feel transcendental. It, to me, is the most auteur facet of game design, as it speaks to the director's vision more so than anything else in my eyes. Dark Souls combat has always felt workmanlike. It is a system created to service the exploration. It's simple because it needs to be, and that ethos is a carryover from the Metroidvanias that inspired it. Both Castlevania and Metroid don't offer complex combat. That's not the point of the games. In Dark Souls, the world and the diversity of choice present in it, both from an itemization and direction standpoint, introduces complexity into a Souls game. The light attack, heavy attack, rolling attack paradigm is so basic by comparison that it at no point has the depth needed to hoist the genre on its back and carry it into the mainstream. Dark Souls 1 would have been a footnote in the early 2010s if it weren't for Lordran. Lies of P is that. It's Dark Souls without the level design, and the load-bearing pillar of combat seriously struggled to keep my interest, because this deliberately paced system was never meant to service a linear, corridor-driven action RPG. It simply isn't deep or rewarding enough, and I think the developers knew this, which is why they attached as many systems recognized by the Souls-like as possible. Perfect parries from Sekiro, the rally system from Bloodborne, and even a diverse pool of quote-unquote trick weapons. It's an amalgam of the different combat options present throughout the Souls games, but without the singular function that lends so well to making those systems rewarding. Contrary to what you may think, I didn't hate Lies of P. I thought it was alright in the same way that some of the better Souls-likes are alright. It accurately recreated a facsimile of the Dark Souls combat system and even improved on it in some ways. It paired its combat system with pretty good boss fights that prioritized ball-crushing difficulty and patience, the classic two tropes of Dark Souls' most over-exaggerated successes. It must be a skill issue then, because I am getting far too old to want to spend hours upon hours cycling my nuts through the hydraulic press of Souls-like boss fights. I don't think the original Dark Souls games are all that hard. I mean, you can literally kill a boss in around 10 swings, and I think difficulty being such a focal point is frankly a detriment to design. This is partly what I loved so much about Elden Ring, my favorite game of all time. Not only the ability to approach something in a varied way, but the ability to approach many a thing in any way. It came at a perfect time where I began to see more enjoyment from exploration, build diversity, and narrative composition than from 6 perfectly timed dodges to avoid a waterfowl dance. I think difficulty is an important aspect of a Souls-like, but it is a garnish that elevates rather than the main dish that overpowers. Lies of P isn't the hardest game of all time, but due to its focus on singular combat, it frustrated me more than any FromSoft game because there was nothing else to look forward to. The combat was the singular purpose, so I hope you enjoy your 4 or 5 combat strings against the next gauntlet of enemies. Whereas a boss acts as a final obstacle to overcome to achieve the end result of an area in a Souls game, the boss is the end result in Lies of P due to the dearth of intrigue in its level design and therefore its reward structure. This is all to say that Lies of P operates by the same mantra that most mechanical influences do. Much like one may leave aside the depth of Pinocchio, one is just as likely to leave behind the depth of Dark Souls, because to translate that depth is to not only understand its merits, but to have the audacity and talent to iterate on them. To recreate a combat system is to recreate a system. Change up the animation slightly, add some novel features here and there, and it can be roughly identical to anything else within the genre. You do not have that option with world design, with level design. You can't just crib the entirety of Lordran from Dark Souls 1, so most Souls-likes just don't. They rather not try, and when they do, they take the simplest possible representation of what can be perceived as the quote-unquote Souls world experience. Hell, even Lies of P does this. It does not open from this side, your character and/or a UI pop-up may explain, and we all collectively nod and agree that yes, that is in fact what a Dark Souls would do. What I'm trying to say is that mechanical inspiration, much like aesthetic inspiration, replicates what may be the simplest elements and forgoes the complexity that could in some cases be crucial to making a project tick. This is of course not always the case. Shortly after my playthrough of Lies of P, I also gave Lords of the Fallen a shot, only to discover the opposite side of the same coin. Much like Lies of P, Lords of the Fallen is a Souls-like that attempts to recreate what it perceives to be the best elements of the series while putting a novel twist on the tried and true formula. However, unlike Lies of P, its focus is explicitly on level design. The combat is worse, the boss fights are far worse, borderline bad, and the visuals are less inspired, yet I came away feeling about as warmly toward Lords of the Fallen as I did Lies of P because it attempted to tackle a far more difficult system than Souls combat. Did it succeed? Not entirely, but it did well enough that looping back into the main hub area more than 10 years after I played my first Souls game still made me smile. It translated the language of the Souls level far more faithfully than most games within the genre have, and while it may do all of those other things worse than Lies of P, just that fact alone made me enjoy it about as much. That is the impact of mechanical depth and, more importantly, mechanical novelty, because good level design, as strange as it may seem, does still feel like a novelty within your standard non-From Software Souls-like. The influence of Dark Souls has been reduced to its most replicable elements, and that has given me the sad realization that I don't like Souls-like games. I just like From Software. Thank you for following me on that tangent, because believe it or not, it's crucial to parsing what about RuneScape's influence has been lost, or, more shockingly, never been found. World of Warcraft is undeniably the most popular MMORPG, so seeing a flood of WoW clones in the mid-2000s made sense. Nowadays, MMOs tend to inhabit a stranger space, but the safe choice to replicate World of Warcraft at one point was the standard design language that dominated the market. But it wasn't just a safe choice from a marketing standpoint, it was the safe choice in every conceivable way. World of Warcraft, as much as I used to love it, and to a certain extent still do love it, is fairly simple. In fact, when it launched in 2004, it was seen as the more mainstream, simplified version of popular MMOs at the time. It offered more conveniences and did so through less obtuse UX. It brought the MMO into the mainstream due to the simplicity of its platform. Replicating that, in theory, should be easy. Where WoW succeeded and its clones failed, other than just the difficult task of asking 10 million players to ditch a game they already have invested in for a new game that is virtually identical but isn't remotely as established, is in capturing world in the world of Warcraft. And this only became harder and harder as the technological envelope was pushed by the modern-day renderers and engines. Developers wanted to recreate WoW but make the graphics quote-unquote better, more appealing, without realizing that the graphics are not the selling point of the game. In fact, they can more often be a limitation. High-fidelity graphics may look great in a trailer, but they pose enormous problems down the line. Creating a world this large and this populated with more demanding performance and a greater workload is untenable, especially for something that has yet to develop a name for itself. WoW launched in the now-dead era of guideless entertainment. People have yet to begin stratifying the moment-to-moment beats of whatever game they are playing throughout the internet. Everything had yet to be solved, and the areas that were leading the guide trend were driven by communities of collaborative individuals guessing together. This changed half a decade after, so all of those WoW clones faced an even more uphill battle. They had to develop the endgame that WoW never needed to launch with, but now has a monopoly on. There's a reason why none of these clones succeeded, and the one that did explicitly carved out its own narrative niche, Final Fantasy XIV. Even simple games harbor the complexities of live service design. But where does that leave RuneScape? Its cultural influence as opposed to its mechanical influence has only grown, and that's likely because of the latter issue. If replicating World of Warcraft's simple systems was still too challenging in the market space, then how do you propose replicating a game that is 10 times as complex? It's a funny dichotomy, because RuneScape visually on its surface is so basic, yet it harbors a collection of emergent and manufactured systems that intertwine so gracefully and confoundingly that even beginning to untangle them is a task better fit for game theory and not game design. The mosaic of 23, soon to be 24 skills in Oldschool Runescape are the nervous system in the body of the game itself. Each one somehow connects to the other, pinging information back and forth. With every update, this nervous system grows, it expands and becomes more and more mature, complex, until the very notion of recreating it begins to, lose all meaning. What does it mean to create the mechanics present in RuneScape? The task is not to just establish a host of interconnected systems, but to predict the use of these systems. For example, an open player-driven economy. It is to verify that these systems would continue to work unimpeded by innovative new updates that continue to transform the pre-existing norms. Let's take a look at the integration of the Guardians of the Rift minigame. This update sought to add a new way to train what is often considered to be the worst skill in the game, runecraft. This skill, much like many long-standing skills in Oldschool Runescape, has plenty of issues that stem from its age and use cases. While I may love the depth of Oldschool Runescape, it's undeniable that many of its interweaving systems are also struggling to function as intended, and in many ways have ceased to function entirely. Runecraft was intended to be the primary source of runes, the currency used to cast magic in the game. To craft runes, you'd need pure essence that can be mined or obtained as a drop from a monster, as well as a talisman corresponding to the rune you're trying to craft. You would take these items to a runic altar, bespoke locations throughout the game world that are associated with one of the specific runes, and then enter it using the talisman and proceed to sacrifice your mined essence to transform it into a few dozen runes at best. This process is very slow, very arduous, and not particularly rewarding because the output is so minuscule. That isn't to say there haven't been profitable ways to do this, but they are generally suffocated by the non-entity that is the rest of the skill. Put simply, no one does this shit. The creators of the game, Jagex, added a new, slightly less tedious method of runecraft in 2016 with the release of their first new continent, Horrend. This edition immediately became the more popular method in later levels thanks to its slightly improved quality of life and more acceptable outputs. 6 years later, in 2022, the next incarnation of improvements was released, which is the Guardians of the Rift minigame. In my eyes, there are 3 ways to AL a struggling skill. 1. An additive approach, creating more width in its pre-existing methods of training, such as a new type of tree for woodcutting or a new rune to craft. 2. A transformative approach, adding an entirely new training avenue and archetype, such as a minigame, Tempros for fishing, Wintertodt for firemaking, Hollowed Sepulchre for agility, and so on. And 3. A recreation. You can rework the skill entirely. The lattermost option is by far the healthiest, as it allows the developers to apply their retrospective knowledge without the baggage of tech debt or clunky mechanics, but also one that requires the most development time and could potentially lead to the most player backlash, especially in a game like Oldschool Runescape, where many of its players are attached to the great and not so great systems grandfathered in from ancient times. By and large, Jagex has chosen the second transformative option, a new system on top of the pre-existing one that has further rendered the older methods of training totally irrelevant. Line fires are not really a thing after level 50, as most players go to Wintertodt. Tempros is more diverse an option, but that's mainly because fishing in and of itself wasn't particularly broken, and Guardians of the Rift has become ubiquitous. It offers a more active, rewarding, and fun method of training without needing to rework the skill itself. Does this fix runecraft? No, not even a little. Much like Giant's Foundry didn't fix smithing, smithing is still essentially useless in its most standard intended purpose, as a method of crafting weapons and armor. No one does this because the process of mining and smithing is outdated by around 2 decades, and it doesn't seem as though Jagex has much interest in fixing that due to the existing knowledge that certain players would be upset regardless of how positive the changes were. The intersectionality of RuneScape skills is not all perfect. A complex game will always struggle under the weight of its systems, as any change has the potential to have the negative ripple effect, impacting more than just the narrow adjustment's intention. This is doubly true for live service MMOs that don't have the option for traditional sequels. They must build on top of their prior architecture. It's like a layered city, with the past withering away, becoming an overgrown ruin. To me, this is more palatable than the theme park alternative, wherein you move the city entirely, foregoing layers in favor of a new patch of land. This is the World of Warcraft method. There are no overgrown ruins underneath the surface, just dirt. To create the body of RuneScape requires what has to be sheer luck micromanaged by talented developers. As a result of its player-driven economy and player-driven updates, it feels like an autonomous entity, a ship steering itself with the developers as its crew, patching its leaking hull and fueling its pumping engine. What is clear is that to achieve the success and depth of RuneScape is to operate in hindsight. This is true even for Jagex, as RuneScape has failed once or even twice before. The current popularity of Oldschool Runescape was only achieved after its inception as a release of a 2007 backup of the game, which was itself a response to a catastrophic update to its main game. Not every studio has the opportunity to turn back the clock and blaze a new trail, but even when they do, it often doesn't work out in the same way. The most immediate influence one can point to is World of Warcraft itself. I don't think it's a difficult argument to make that the release of WoW Classic in 2019 was as a result of seeing Oldschool RuneScape's continued success, but even that is not entirely true, considering OSRS was on the verge of failure until it began to receive bespoke updates curated by its players years after its initial release. Classic WoW became emblematic of Blizzard's half-desperate, half-daring ethos of the time. What if? We no longer need to ask that question, because now we know Blizzard is content with running the gamut. The original incarnation of Classic WoW is primed to release the Mists of Pandaria expansion and is closer in gameplay now to the retail modern game than it is its classic origination. Therefore, Blizzard released another re-release of Classic, and before that, the Season of Discovery, another point of inspiration from RuneScape, taking from League's, Jagex's successful limited-time game mode. These influences, though, are cultural, not mechanical or aesthetic. They are based on the financial success, not on the game itself. WoW is no closer to being similar to RuneScape than it ever was. This leads us back to the original question: why the hell is it so difficult to find a game that competes with RuneScape? We have determined that RuneScape is more systemically difficult to replicate, so attempts may feel futile. It has a monopoly on its curated sandbox style, but not by Jagex's doing. This monopoly occurred by default. Aesthetic inspirations are present in some ways. As we discussed, Flyknight immediately calls back to RuneScape's MIDI sound effects and soundtrack. Even the aliased font is clearly inspired by its typography. But that's where the inspiration ends. Flyknight is not like RuneScape outside of these cherry-picked aesthetics that I described. This is what led us down the Dark Souls rabbit hole, wherein we found another title or series of titles that has had an immense cultural influence, yet its mechanical successes are almost as ignored as RuneScape's, at least when it comes to level design. Could it be that difficulty is, ironically, the limiting factor? I can't say for certain. However, the image of a game developer is rarely one of lacking patience or design talent. There must be another alternative. It could be that influence, as esoteric as the concept is, manifests in equally diaphanous ways. RuneScape's cultural sway is palpable, so could it be possible that the new retro trend scene in today's indie space is as inspired by the continued relevance of RuneScape as it is the hazy memories of King's Field? The true answer will of course never be known, because influence in this sense is layers removed from creating a 3D dark fantasy RPG with vague mysticism and grandiose themes of rebirth with a title like Dark Souls. It exists in the intangible space a memory does, and that could be the nostalgic feeling one gets from playing RuneScape even though they've never played it before, or the addictive feeling of getting something from it that is unavailable in other MMOs. The mechanical depths of RuneScape are undeniably impressive to anyone even passingly interested in game design, but the true influence is its stalwart, immutable adherence to a simple fact: age is not quality. With proper care and attention, what you created 20 years ago may have just as much merit today. MMOs may have evolved in a different direction, away from RuneScape, valuing short-form releases of dopamine and the lingering, ever-present system of seasonality, yet RuneScape, much like Jagex chose to in 2013, stayed the course. It refused to align itself with trends, and as a result, its success has become a proof, an equation that is answered by the very same fact it adheres to. While its innovative and iterative victories as the most popular sandbox MMO hasn't punched through the thick brick of modern-day MMO paradigms, it has filtered almost unnoticeably into the unconscious pervading much more than just a single genre. In that sense, it does remind me of Dark Souls' most influential beats that have overshadowed its greatest genre successes. RuneScape's continued popularity may be due to its systems and long-form appeal, but components that remain in the minds of those who last played it a day or decade ago are characterized by a more profound stuff. If you ever find yourself asking why aren't there more games doing what RuneScape is, why is it so hard to find a RuneScape-like, whereas so many other titles have been able to be recreated by inspired developers and fans? It could be the complexity of design, sure, but on a more meta level, you are playing games buoyed by RuneScape's influence, but in lieu of cherry-picking its combat or progression, they have instead synthesized its ability to bring the past to the present and capture the greatest features while continuing to iterate on the base function. It's not so simple as nostalgic imitations. Take a look at the boomer shooter genre based on the likes of Doom and Quake. The most beloved ones are not resting on the laurels of the titles that inspired them. It isn't enough for Ultrakill to recreate the combat of Doom. Instead, it opts to retain the spirit while iterating on just about everything else, integrating years upon years of design evolution in the medium to create something as reminiscent of the past as it is transformative of it. Somehow, these types of games are harnessing nostalgia, but only conceptually, only as an entry point. They manage to, through meticulous and effectual game design, give you the experience of what playing its influences may have felt like 20-odd years ago, while not adhering to their strict limitations. By that same token, Oldschool Runescape evokes nostalgia and gives a new player similar emotions to that of someone playing it 10 or 15 years ago, but doing so through evolution. That is the heart of this process. These games aren't in some nostalgic stasis where change is frowned upon. Change is and should be welcomed. Oldschool Runescape is not the game it was in 2007. It's not even the game it was in 2015. Much like Ultrakill is not Doom or Quake, much like Flyknight is not King's Field. Influence is adaptive. You don't need to base your project on a pre-existing source narratively to perform the action of adaptation, much like you can adhere to the principles of the past while simultaneously not shying away from evolutions that feel more natural in today's environment. Better put, we're not turning the camera with our arrow keys anymore, and that's a good thing. If RuneScape's most impactful influence is conceptual, then it can take credit for much more than pale imitations. If we ever find ourselves wondering why there are no MMOs like RuneScape, instead we should all feel grateful that RuneScape exists far beyond just a single genre.